Hi, my name's Pete Knapp, an air quality PhD student at Imperial College London. This series of podcasts is kindly promoted by the Grantham Institute, the college's hub for climate change and environment. Subscribe to receive future episodes and contact the Grantham Institute on Twitter with @Grantham_IC and me with @PeteK_AQ. This is Tipping Points, a podcast featuring interviews with people who have become environmental activists. What made them change? What are they doing now? And what do they hope to see in the future as we face possible breakdown of civilization and life on Earth? This first series focuses on scientists in the UK. With me in this episode is Dr. Charlie Gardner from Norfolk. Welcome.
Hi Pete, thanks very much for the opportunity to come and chat to you today.
How are you doing, by the way?
Yeah, a bit frazzled today actually. It's turned into a more intense day than would have been ideal. Trying to get back into the habit of saying fine thanks when people ask how I am.
I know what you mean. I've fallen into the trap of actually telling people how I am,
Yeah.
And then they wish they hadn't asked.
Yep. So yeah, I'm fine, thanks.
In 3 minutes, do you think you could outline your life story?
Ever since I was really, really young, I've been interested in the conservation of nature. I grew up around the Western Indian Ocean and in Southern Africa. My dad was a hotel manager and kept on getting moved around to different places. And everywhere we lived, he made friends with local conservationists. So I grew up surrounded by wildlife conservationists. And really, it's all I've ever wanted to do. I did an undergraduate degree in zoology, I did a master's in conservation, and then as soon as I could, I went abroad again to biodiversity-rich tropical countries. And I spent 10 years living in Madagascar, helping establish new protected areas that are co-managed by wildlife conservation organizations and the local communities that live on that land. Since then, I moved back to England in 2015, and started lecturing at the University of Kent. So I now spend most of my time divided between lecturing and a bit of writing and research and activism.
What are you working on at the moment?
I'm moving away more and more from a focus on research because I think we are in an emergency. And I think scientists need to do more. So, of course, research is hugely important. But I don't think research alone is enough to catalyze the kinds of really urgent changes we need. So, actually, most of my academic work is no longer focused on wildlife conservation. It's focused on the idea of academics as activists. And what really interests me now is how to encourage scientists to move beyond the traditional bounds of what we do and take further steps, just because what we have always done is no longer enough in this time of rapidly accelerating multiple crises.
How does your employer feel about you working on that kind of stuff?
I've had a lot of support from the university. Of course, the university are very supportive of all forms of public engagement. You know, the two traditional strands of academic activity are research and teaching. But more and more universities recognize that they have an important role to play in civil society and in educating the public as well as their students. It becomes slightly more complex when we're talking about non-violent civil disobedience and breaking the law. I've long wondered where the line I cannot cross with my university is, but so far I've had nothing but reassurances that they will support my academic freedom. I do speak to my students about civil disobedience movements, and I do encourage them to engage with them, but I certainly have never encouraged them to break the law, just because I don't think it's my place as a lecturer to do that.
I've got a lot of questions to ask following that about your feeling towards protesting and so on. But at this stage, I'd like to ask a bit more about your time in Madagascar. So you spent 10 years there. What is the current situation there?
So Madagascar is a very interesting place for conservationists to work because all the biodiversity in Madagascar is unique. It's been isolated from the African mainland for an extremely long time, for 95 million years before the end of the dinosaurs. Everything that's there has evolved in isolation for an extremely long time and is different to things you find elsewhere. 90% of the plants, 100% of the lemurs, 99% of the amphibians and reptiles, apart from the sea turtles. Even birds, birds are great voyagers and can hop from place to place, but 52% of all the bird species occur only in Madagascar. So that means Madagascar is a huge priority for conservation. Many people consider it to be the world's #1 conservation priority. Things disappear from Madagascar and then they are gone, they are extinct. It's also one of the poorest nations in the world. There's a lack of infrastructure, there's a lack of industry, there's a lack of jobs, and that means in rural areas, people have a really high dependence on biodiversity. People depend hugely on coastal fisheries. 90% or more of all the households in the country cook on wood or charcoal, and much of that is coming from natural forests. So it's a really important place to work on the sustainable management of natural resources, because it's much more than a conservation issue. It's a humanitarian issue.
Although Madagascar, you say, has been isolated in terms of nature, but really has it been isolated from humanity for that period of time as well?
Yes, so it was one of the last major land masses on Earth to be colonized by people. Even though it's very close to the coast of Africa, it didn't have any large-scale human populations until extraordinarily recently. So the two major land masses that were most recently colonized are New Zealand and Madagascar. And until 5 or 6 years ago, there was no evidence of any people on Madagascar at all until about 2,000 years ago. There's now increasing evidence that there were actually small populations of people in Madagascar before then. There were people there, but they were hunter-gatherers living in small bands, and they certainly didn't have major impacts on the landscape. It was only within the last 2,000 years that other people arrived from what is now Indonesia, from the island of Borneo, and brought rice cultivation and started to have large towns and what we might call civilization. So people's land use practices tends to be very destructive, and that's caused a virtually incessant deforestation since people arrived up till now, and we find ourselves in this situation where there is very little forest remaining now.
That's fascinating. I know that there are quite a lot of analogues you can draw between Madagascar and Borneo, because they are fairly large islands, and wildlife that exists on that island may not exist on another one. For example, the rhino that we think is now extinct in Borneo. Do we see any kind of megafauna like that in Madagascar going the same way?
Well, we did. Unfortunately, we're a bit late in the game to conserve Madagascar's megafauna. Until as recently as 500 years ago, there were thought to be at least 23 species of giant lemur, all of which are larger than the largest existing species today, and the largest of which was the size of a silverback gorilla. These things were enormous. There were also some very large birds called elephant birds. So these are related to the ostriches, emus, and rheas and cassowaries, but they existed only in Madagascar, the largest of which was called Aepyornis maximus, and it was 2 meters tall. No, sorry, it might have been 3 meters tall. I'm struggling to remember. Its egg was the largest cell there has ever been, the largest biological cell there has ever been. There were pygmy hippos too. And in certain places in Madagascar, there are all sorts of folk tales of these amazing creatures, these giant lemurs and these giant birds, that they were around so recently that they still persist in people's folk memories. There are baobab trees alive today whose seeds were dispersed by giant lemurs. It's a tragic tale, really, of just how recently things have been lost.
What were your initial feelings towards the deforestation you saw there and the unsustainable practices? And how have your feelings of that changed over those 10 years?
When I first went to Madagascar, I was really, really focused on wildlife conservation, and I was less interested in people. I had quite a negative view of people. I saw people as a problem. Over my time there, working with rural Malagasy communities, I've become much more empathetic and also much more understanding of the importance of biodiversity and functioning ecosystems in supporting people. So while, of course, unsustainable practices are a problem, that doesn't mean people are bad. And people are, of course, also the solution. When one looks at deforestation as an outsider, it's very easy to sort of demonize the farmers and think, they are destroying this precious global resource. But people don't do it through choice. They engage in deforestation because they have no other option. It's not a livelihood of choice. These are the poorest of the poor. But people are forced to do it because of a lack of good agricultural land, a lack of irrigation infrastructure in particular. This is a real problem. And that forces people to engage in these livelihoods, which are simultaneously suboptimal for them and highly destructive of the environment. So that means that there's real opportunities to intervene there. The old school approach to conservation, which is local people are the problem, we need to have protected areas and put a fence around the forest and everybody out. That's really not the answer. It doesn't work. One, because it further impoverishes people. Two, because it makes enemies of people that should be partners. And of course, there's a real colonial arrogance to that we as outsiders want to persuade your government to not let you cut down the forest anymore. Conservation used to be like that in Madagascar, but it's very much transitions to community-based approaches where outsiders bring some expertise and investment and work with local communities to generate solutions that can help contribute both to conservation goals and local communities' needs and development goals.
So they must have lived their sustainable and symbiotic way with nature for those 2,000 years, always fishing and always using wood in a sustainable way. But what made them change recently?
Actually, I think it's not quite the case. Madagascar is an absolutely vast island. It's twice the size of the UK. So when resources are freely available, you have no need to innovate ways of using them sustainably because they're plentiful. It's when they start to become rare that you are induced to innovate and develop more sustainable systems. And we see this in Madagascar. In areas that are far from the forest frontier, people have improved agricultural systems, terraced rice cultivation and things, which allow them to continue using the same fields year on year because they have no more forests to eke out new fields. I think that also points to an important role for conservationists. Madagascar is now approaching the end game. There's only 10% of its forests left, and these are disappearing really rapidly. Farmers in Madagascar will have to innovate improved agricultural systems soon enough anyway. In Madagascar, it's a bit different in that most deforestation isn't really driven by the growth of export commodities. It is still driven by small-scale farmers, primarily growing food for subsistence and for domestic markets.
And since you joined Extinction Rebellion in 2018, you helped to develop aspects of the Emergency on Planet Earth document related to the ecological and biodiversity crisis. What is this document and what's its purpose?
I think it's a wonderful document for a number of reasons. One, it is highly accessible, and this is a real problem with science. The other real value of this, we call it a document. I think of it as a book. It's just not a printed one. The real value of it is that it brings together such a diversity of different sources of information from different fields. It covers the whole climate and ecological crisis. So you're talking about from atmospheric science to oceanic science to glaciology to ecology to all sorts. And for those of us that are trying to find out about these things, there is no one-stop shop. There is no place where you can go and get all this information in one place and in an easily digestible form. For those wanting to know more, I think it is an absolutely fantastic resource.
I wonder, though, if there needs to be some guidance in terms of mental health for people who read a huge document like this. It can be exhausting emotionally. What would you say to people who feel, after they've read all of this, they just feel like, oh, no, we're headed to disaster, I can't read anymore?
This is a huge issue that society is only really waking up to over the last few years. Many conservationists are well used to what some people call ecological grief, the sadness with just knowing what we've already done to our planet. An emerging issue is climate anxiety, the fear of what's coming. And many of us in conservation have been dealing with these issues our whole lives and our whole careers. Honestly, when I was 6 years old, I was suffering from ecological grief and climate anxiety. I've spent my whole life living in deep fear of what the future may hold. I somehow managed to compartmentalize my knowledge so that I can carry on and work on these things. Many people are becoming engaged with these ideas and becoming aware of the full horror of what we face for the first time. And of course, that can exact a huge emotional toll. So the first thing is to be aware of it. Psychologists are increasingly aware of it. Psychotherapists are increasingly aware of it. To me, I think some of the most important things are, firstly, knowing that you're not alone and that many other people feel like this. And the other thing, I think, is doing something about it. The strength of climate anxiety comes from a feeling of hopelessness and a feeling that there's some inevitability to what's coming. And I think we can overcome that to a large extent by doing something, by taking action. Taking action makes us feel less hopeless, and it makes us feel that at least we tried, at least I've done what I can. And that's a hugely important and powerful feeling. It is not game over. Nothing is predetermined, and we can still avoid the very worst of it. Yes, we are heading to a minimum of 2 degrees heating and probably 3 degrees heating, but every fraction of a percent of a degree will mean a whole heap less suffering and destruction and death. So there's a huge amounts to fight for. Yes, things will get very bad, but they will get a hell of a lot worse if we don't take action and do what we can. Of course, there are limits to what we can achieve through behavior change, and that's because we live within unsustainable systems. We are obliged to live within the systems we live in. So I think the emphasis on personal change, lifestyle change, is hugely overblown. What we need to do is change the systems that we live in to allow us to live sustainable lifestyles. Of course, many of us do try to be as sustainable as we can. I know I do. I don't kid myself that personal changes I make will have a huge impact on the environment. They're a drop in the ocean. However, I do them because that's what I want to do. It makes me feel better to be doing the little things I can. Much more important to me is to work towards changing the system. I think placing the emphasis on personal responsibility to engage in personal change is a huge cop-out. Let's take meat production, for example. Over the last few years, scientists have produced all this evidence that transitioning to plant-based diets can have huge impacts both on the ecological crisis and the climate crisis. And so we see more and more encouragement throughout the media to have more plant-based diets. However, we are still bombarded with advertising to eat meat. If you walk down a high street in a town, you're just going to see adverts. The whole system is geared towards us eating meat. So it's ridiculous to then say to people, oh, don't eat meat, whilst everything is encouraging them to eat meat. So we have to change the system so we're not producing cheap meat anymore, but our systems promote the availability of plant-based food and make that cheap and accessible so that people who can't currently afford to eat organic food or eat purely plant-based food can also afford it. The concept of the personal carbon footprint, that's a deliberate campaign to shift the responsibility for climate change from fossil fuel companies to individuals. I reject that responsibility entirely. Yes, I'm responsible for certain aspects of my carbon footprint, for example, aviation, which I've now essentially given up. I live in a fossil fuel dependent society. You can't blame me for that. That's not my fault. We need to shift the responsibility back onto those driving the problem and not the innocent people that are just trying to live within a broken system.
Some people would argue, though, that companies are responding to the demand.
It doesn't come out of nowhere. Demand is created by advertising. Take cars, for example. The biggest growth in the European automotive sector is in SUVs, large gas-guzzling cars. That's not come out of nowhere. That's not because people intrinsically want big energy intensive cars, it's because that desire has been created by advertising. At the same time, the automotive sector has worked to prevent government investment in alternatives, active transport, public transport. As a result, we all pay a huge subsidy to cars. We've given our cities to cars. We accept extraordinary things for cars, huge levels of air pollution, which is one of the biggest killers around. I think demand is created through advertising.
Now, tell me a bit more about yourself. Do you have a family?
I don't actually. My knowledge of what's coming has stopped me wanting to have children. Growing up, I always just assumed that one day I would have children. And yeah, I love children. I love my nephews and nieces, but I cannot bring myself to bring a child into this world knowing what is coming. I just do not think that is fair. Humanity has sort of had this assumption that time is progress and that things are always getting better and better and better. We're starting to see now that that is a lie. We see that now with the younger generations and millennials who are not able to buy houses like their parents were, and who are suffering much greater income inequality than their parents' generation did. So in terms of our social systems and opportunities for young people, there just aren't the opportunities there that there were in the past. I really think that if we don't radically transform our society, specifically our economies, within the next decade, then the shit is going to hit the fan and things are going to get really, really bad. And I do not want to bring a child into a dying world.
You're a keen protester and you've stood in a number of protests since 2018. Do you think they're effective?
They get people talking about climate change, and it does work. And the proof is in the pudding. Since XR started in 2018, there has been unparalleled media coverage of climate change and nature destruction. There was a primetime TV climate change debate before the last general election. And that concern for the environment has persisted despite the COVID pandemic. And what you're seeing now, talking heads on the media saying, ooh, I agree with their message, I agree with their cause, but I don't like their tactics. The thing is, that is already a big win. They would never, before that, they were never even talking about climate change. And they certainly weren't saying, I agree that we need to do something about climate change. But now they are saying, I agree that we need to do something about climate change. I just don't like their tactics. People have always said this. Take the suffragette movement, for example. They engaged in non-violent civil obedience. It worked. And women got the vote because of that. Look at the civil rights movement in the USA. People engaged in non-violent civil disobedience and they won increased rights for people of color. And yeah, the reactions were the same. We look at the suffragettes, Emmeline Pankhurst, we look at Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks now, and we treat them as heroes now, but the press and the general public certainly did not treat them as heroes at the time. They were hated. They were reviled as dangerous dissenters. And we now see these people as heroes. And we see the same thing with Extinction Rebellion. In the 1930s, people said, ooh, I agree women should have the vote, but I don't like their tactics. In the 1960s, people said, ooh, I agree people of color should have more civil rights, but I don't like their tactics. And it's the same thing now. People will look back at Extinction Rebellion in the same way as we look back at the suffragettes and Martin Luther King now. Extinction Rebellion will be regarded as heroes, whatever the media say about them now.
And have you stood in protest? Presumably you have.
Yes.
How have they been?
They have been hugely uplifting experiences. Of course, it's difficult. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of emotional energy to spend days out in the street in big crowds of people, but they are also hugely uplifting events. You feel the power of community. While they take a lot out of me, I think they give me back so much more.
Would you then consider putting yourself into a situation where you might be arrested?
So I've tried to get arrested a couple of times. I've blocked a street as part of a movement with XR scientists. We were there blocking the streets. The police told us that if we didn't move, we would be arrested. And then they physically picked us up and carried us out of the street. To my great surprise, they just plonked us down on the side of the street. And I don't know whether this was because they didn't have the capacity at the time to actually handle and process more arrests, or whether it was because of the visibility. Because this wasn't just any XR action, this was XR scientists, and we were all there in lab coats. I wonder whether they were reluctant to arrest a bunch of scientists because of the publicity that would cause.
Do you think then the advantage of being arrested, the publicity that it would bring?
Yes, absolutely. Part of the reason why perhaps the general public haven't grasped the urgency of the situation we're in is because many scientists will talk about how we are in an emergency and how society has to change, but they don't act like it's an emergency. And that really sends a powerful message, I think, that actually it's not that urgent. If scientists are saying that it's an emergency but not acting like it, then that makes you think, well, is it really? So I think scientists have a particular moral obligation to act and to act visibly. Now, of course, I understand that many scientists aren't in a position to put themselves up for arrest. I'm in a privileged position that I can do that. I have some financial security, so I'm not too concerned about losing my job. You know, I'm a white male. I'm not going to be discriminated against. Nevertheless, being arrested is just the tip of the iceberg of XR actions. It's just the most visible of our actions. For every person that volunteers to put themselves in an arrestable position, there are 20 others behind them. We can also lend legitimacy to these movements. I can't remember what it was that Boris Johnson described us as, but it was like uncooperative crusties and mung bean eating freaks or something. And of course, there's nothing wrong with being an uncooperative crusty, but one of the media tactics to try to undermine our legitimacy is to pretend that we are weirdos. We are some sort of other. We are different from you. And therefore, this is not something that you should get engaged in. But there are city professionals and lawyers and doctors and scientists. Scientists can have a real key role in helping legitimize these movements. If the government says, or the Daily Mail says, oh, these are just a bunch of hippies, well, actually we're not. And when scientists stand up and say, no, I think they're doing the right thing, I support them, then that's a really powerful message.
How many of your colleagues do you think would be prepared to stand with you in a protest, and how many of them do you think see you as a bit of a maverick?
Difficult question. Certainly, scientists in general are very career focused. And one of the barriers to engaging with these movements is this idea that scientists have to be detached, to provide information and nothing else, not to act on the implications of that information. This idea that if we adopt a position, then that somehow reduces our credibility. And for very career-focused scientists, the idea of losing credibility or being perceived as not being an objective scientist anymore is a very fearful idea. In fact, the public do feel that scientists should engage more in advocacy and adopt a position. Greta Thunberg is a wonderful example of the power of emotional communication. Scientists have been trying to communicate the urgency of the climate crisis in rational terms for decades. Along comes one 16-year-old girl, starts speaking to us in emotive language, really getting us in the gut with the sheer power of her communication, and suddenly the whole world is listening. That's something we need to do more as a scientific community, is engage in more emotive language. Speak about not what this means for me as a scientist, but what this means for me as a person and husband and uncle.
Speaking of gut punches, we've had David Attenborough speaking recently to the UN Security Council saying that climate change could, within a lifetime, destroy entire cities and societies. That's quite a powerful statement. How did you react when you first heard that?
Yes, it is powerful. To be honest, I'm immersing myself in these messages every day. My life is built around this knowledge of what's coming. So I take this so for granted that it doesn't hold so much power for me anymore. What's really amazing to me is to hear that these kinds of discourses are entering the mainstream. People can hear scientists saying things, but they don't know and love those scientists. David Attenborough is a beloved person that has made a huge contribution to people's lives, their whole lives. They've been watching his shows. So to hear it coming from people like him, I think is hugely powerful. And it is wonderful that he is dedicating so much of his later life, not just to broadcasting the wonder of the natural world, but to talking about the threats it faces and the urgency of action.
Why do you think then that he hasn't outwardly supported Extinction Rebellion?
I don't know, to be honest. Perhaps he doesn't feel he can condone law breaking as a law-abiding citizen, but whilst he hasn't explicitly supported Extinction Rebellion, I think he has implicitly supported us. I saw a quote from him the other day saying, "Nothing we can do is radical enough." Now, if that isn't an endorsement of Extinction Rebellion, then I don't know what is.
On the final topic, I'd like to ask you a few questions related to the pandemic. There have been some positive steps towards opening life back up after this stage of the pandemic. How do you think that the world will deal with the next one?
We've had a trial run for the next one, haven't we? It's interesting that you sort of took it for granted that there will be another one. And I think almost all scientists equally take it for granted that there will be a next one and that it is inevitable, not just a next wave of the pandemic, but a next highly contagious and dangerous viral disease. And that's because the conditions that created this pandemic haven't changed. These viruses, they don't come out of nowhere. These are viruses that exist in other animals, and then they leap into human populations when there is contact between people and other animals. Our destruction of nature increases the likelihood of there being another pandemic. Our globalized society with interconnectedness through air transport makes sure that when there is another epidemic, it spreads and turns into a pandemic. Nothing's changed there. So, of course, we will get pandemics in the future. What the pandemic has shown is that both people and governments can do absolutely extraordinary things when they feel that it's genuinely an emergency and when they feel a genuine threat to themselves. The idea that the government would pay 80% of people's wages to stay at home, the idea that most of the population would voluntarily stay at home for most of a year, these things, we just couldn't possibly conceive them, and yet they have happened. Society can do extraordinary things and make extraordinary changes when we perceive the imminence of the threat. There is the risk that governments will say, no, sorry, we've spent all the possible money on pandemic responses. We can't afford to spend more on climate change. There's also a risk that will emerge out of this pandemic with sort of emergency fatigue, that both governments and the public just won't have the energy to face another emergency, having been struggling against one for all this time. But we need to stop thinking about what's feasible or what's easy. We need to do what needs to be done. We literally have a world to save. If we don't do it, if we don't make these changes now, then there's an extraordinarily high chance that we will see societal collapse. We will see unbelievable, unimaginable suffering and death and destruction. We will see a vast reduction in the human population. We will see the collapse of society. And when that's what you're faced with, you do what it takes, regardless of what that might cost financially. The sooner we act, the cheaper it will be. The costs of not acting are much, much higher than the costs of making the changes now. So this idea that, it's too expensive to act, we can't possibly fight climate change, that's a lie. That's a false economy. The Bank of England recognize that money spent now on preventing climate change will pay itself off many times over in avoided destruction later on.
Could you give us some insight into what we might expect from Charlie Gardner in the next 5 years or so then?
Well, what I'd really like to do actually is write a book. I've got this book that's been burning a hole in my chest for about 5 years. I really want to write a popular, accessible book about the modern conservation movement. What we can do, what we are doing, and what we need to do to conserve life on Earth. And I know exactly what I want to write. I just never find any time to actually write it.
With that, Dr. Charlie Gardner, thank you.
Pete, this has been brilliant. I've had a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Music from Climate by Eric Ian Walker, commissioned by the Climate Music Project, who communicate the sense of urgency of the climate and ecological crises through the emotional power of music. More to be found at ericianwalker.bandcamp.com and climatemusic.org.